She said it the way you'd suggest skipping a side dish. No weight to it, no hesitation. Just 3 words dropped into the air between my son and my daughter, and neither of them flinched. Don't invite her. I was standing in the hallway outside my son's kitchen, still holding the green bean casserole I'd driven 40 minutes to bring, the dish warm against my palms through the oven mitts I'd forgotten to take off in the car. I'd let myself in through the side door. I'd always had a key. The same spare my son, Kenneth, pressed into my hand the year they moved into this house, 7 years ago now. I came early because I wanted to help. I thought I was being useful. I stood very still. She just makes everything heavier, my daughter-in-law said. Her name is Lindsay. I'd helped pay for her wedding. You invite her and suddenly it's not Thanksgiving anymore. It's her performance. The stories about her hip. The green bean thing. Every year the same green bean thing, and every year nobody touches it. She means well, my son said. I know she means well. Lindsay's voice softened in the way that sounds like kindness but isn't. That doesn't change how exhausting it is. I just think, maybe next year we keep it smaller, just us. Then my daughter's voice, Allison. She'd flown in from Denver for this. I'd picked her up from the airport 2 days earlier, held her coat while she got her luggage, taken her to dinner. She'll notice if we don't include her, Allison said. She'll survive, Lindsay answered. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that the casserole dish started to feel heavy. Long enough that the sounds of the kitchen, the oven timer, the football game in the other room, my granddaughter Cleo somewhere upstairs, all started to feel very far away. I thought about going in anyway. I thought about setting the dish on the counter, smiling the smile I'd practiced for 40 years, pretending I hadn't heard a word. I was good at that. I'd had so much practice. Instead, I put the casserole back in the bag I'd carried it in, quietly, and I let myself out the same side door I'd come through. I drove home without turning on the radio. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after I got back to the house. Monroe's house, really, though he'd been gone 6 years now. We bought it in 1987, when the neighborhood still had a hardware store on the corner and the oak tree in the front yard was thin enough to wrap your arms around. Monroe used to say we'd grow old in it. We almost did. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and looked around at the kitchen I'd spent 30 years feeding people out of. The counter where Monroe used to stand and read the paper. The window above the sink where I once tried to grow herbs, just parsley and thyme, nothing ambitious. The table where Kenneth used to do his homework, and where Allison used to argue with me about curfews, and where, in later years, I used to sit alone on holidays because they were too busy to come. I should have seen it coming. I think if I'm honest with myself, I had. There was the year Kenneth forgot my birthday for the 2nd time in a row, and when I mentioned it, once, gently, he told me I was making it about myself. There was the year Allison stopped calling unless she needed something. The $4,000 I wired to Kenneth and Lindsay when they were short on their property tax. The 3 full years I'd spent babysitting Cleo every Tuesday and Thursday after school, without once being asked how I was doing. Without once being asked anything, really, except could you pick her up a little early this week, and don't forget she can't have dairy now. I'd never kept a ledger. Monroe always said I was too generous to keep score, and he meant it as a compliment. I was starting to think it was a warning. I went upstairs and pulled out the folder I kept in the nightstand. Bank statements, transfer confirmations I'd printed out every time I'd sent money to one of them. I'd kept them without knowing why. Maybe some part of me already knew this day was coming. I spread them on the bed, 6 years of statements. By the 3rd page, the total had passed $50,000, and that wasn't counting the things that had no receipt. The casseroles, the driving, the times I'd canceled my own plans because someone needed a favor, the years I'd smiled and said I was fine when I wasn't, because asking for anything had started to feel like an imposition. I sat there for a long time looking at those numbers, and I thought, I made the green bean casserole. I drove 40 minutes to bring it to them, and they stood in their kitchen, in the house I helped keep out of foreclosure, and talked about whether to bother inviting me. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was finished. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a school librarian, and before that, I raised 2 children in a house with 1 working bathroom and a furnace that gave up every February. Monroe and I didn't have much when the kids were small. One year, all we could afford for Christmas was a secondhand bicycle for Kenneth. The chain kept slipping, and a used sewing kit for Allison, who'd said she wanted to learn to make her own clothes. She never did, but she cried about it for a week, and I stayed up until 2 in the morning sewing a doll dress by hand so she'd have something to open on Christmas morning. I don't tell that story because I want credit. I tell it because it matters that I did it. It matters that I was there. Monroe passed in the winter of 2018. Lung cancer, fast. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. The kids came for the last 2 weeks and the funeral, and then they went back to their lives. I went back to an empty house and learned how to be alone in it. I got through that first Thanksgiving by keeping busy. Cleaned out his closet, organized the bookshelves, made a full dinner I ate standing over the sink because I didn't want to set a table for one. I thought they'd check in more after. I thought losing their father might pull us closer. But grief has a way of making people look away instead of in. Too uncomfortable. Too much of a reminder. So I got quieter. I stopped calling as often. Stopped bringing it up when they canceled plans. Stopped making my needs known because every time I did, I could feel them arranging their faces into patience. I'd gotten very good at being easy to forget. Standing in that hallway, hearing those words, I understood what it had cost me. The bank opened at 9 the next morning. I arrived at 10 after. I sat in the waiting area in a chair designed more for appearance than comfort and asked to speak with someone about my accounts. The woman who came out was in her 50s, silver hair, reading glasses on a beaded chain. She introduced herself as Shirley, and she had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has heard everything. I liked her immediately. I explained what I needed. She didn't ask many questions. She pulled up my accounts and walked me through the recurring transfers. The monthly contribution to Kenneth and Lindsay's home equity line I'd been quietly covering since the rate increased, the quarterly payment toward Allison's student loans I'd been making for 4 years because she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, and I hadn't been able to let that go. How many active transfers? I asked. She counted. 11, she said. I asked her to cancel all of them, effective immediately. She confirmed twice, which I appreciated. Then she did it. I sat for a moment after she finished, just to let it settle. 11 transfers, some of them going back years. I had no idea how long my children had assumed those would keep coming. I suspected they'd stopped thinking about them at all. Money, when it arrives reliably, starts to feel like weather. You don't thank it, you plan around it. When Shirley asked if I'd like to redirect any of the funds elsewhere, I told her yes. I wanted to set up an annual scholarship for a high school student going into library science or education in my husband's name. She smiled. A real one, not a professional one. Monroe, she said, looking at the account name. Monroe Calvin Delaney, I said. He believed in books the way other people believe in medicine. She drafted the paperwork while I waited. I signed everything with a hand that didn't shake. On the way out, I stopped on the sidewalk and called the attorney who'd handled Monroe's estate. There were things in the will that needed to change. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a building on Maple that smelled of old coffee and carpet cleaner. His name was Mr. Edgerton. We'd met twice before, once when Monroe died, once when I updated my health directive. He was a quiet man, thorough, with the kind of handshake that meant something. He didn't ask me to explain myself. I told him what I wanted, and he wrote it down, and we went through it together page by page, the way careful people do. I removed both my children from the primary beneficiary positions. I designated my neighbor Joanne, who had lived 3 houses down for 11 years, who had shoveled my driveway every winter since Monroe died, who had brought me soup twice last year without being asked, as the new beneficiary for the house. I established the Monroe Delaney Scholarship to be administered by the County Library Foundation. Renewable, the kind that keeps going after you're gone. Mr. Edgerton reviewed the final pages and set his pen down. These are good decisions, he said, plainly. I believed him. When I stepped back outside, the November air was sharp and bright. I buttoned my coat and stood on the sidewalk a moment. Across the street, a diner had its open sign lit in the window. I went in and ordered eggs and toast and sat at the counter alone without feeling the need to apologize for it. Thanksgiving morning, I made exactly what I wanted. A small roasted chicken, because a full turkey is a commitment and I was only one person. Sweet potato soup from scratch, with a little ginger and a lot of butter, the way Monroe liked it. Cranberry sauce with orange zest. Rolls from a bakery bag, because I was 67 years old and I had earned the right to buy my rolls. And a lemon icebox pie, which I hadn't made since the year Monroe asked for it specifically, and which had been sitting inside me like something I wasn't allowed to have anymore. I set the table for 3. At noon, Joanne knocked on the door. She was wearing a quilted vest that had seen better days and carrying a covered dish in both hands. Behind her stood her nephew Simon, a tall, quiet young man who ducked his head when I offered my hand. "You didn't have to bring anything," I said. "It's just roasted carrots," she said, "nothing fancy." We ate slowly, the way people do when they're not in a hurry to be anywhere. Joanne told a story about a Thanksgiving in 1989 when her ex-husband tried to deep fry a turkey in the garage and nearly took the door off. Simon asked about the shelves of books in my living room, and I told him about working at the library, and he listened the way young people rarely do, actually listening, not waiting for his turn. Nobody mentioned the children who weren't there. When the pie was done, Joanne took a second slice and pointed her fork at me with the gravity of a woman making an important declaration. "This," she said, "is the best thing I have eaten in this house." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in days. After they left, I sat with my tea in the front room, the plates drying in the rack, the candles burned halfway down. I thought about all the years I'd arranged Thanksgiving like a production. Every preference memorized, every allergy accommodated, every seat filled with someone who had somewhere else they'd rather be. This year, 3 people sat at my table. They came because they wanted to. They brought carrots. They asked about books. Maybe that was always the whole point. Not how many, just whether they meant it. The calls started the next morning. Kenneth first, then Allison twice, then Lindsay from what I recognized as her work number, which told me she was trying to seem official about it. I let them all go to voicemail. Kenneth's message said there'd been an issue with an account transfer. Could I call him back? Allison's second message had a different tone. "Mom, I need you to call me. Something's going on and I don't understand it." I didn't call back that day or the day after. What I understood, because I knew my children, was that the account notices had arrived. The mortgage assistance, the loan payments, the transfers that had moved like clockwork for years without anyone paying attention to where they came from, all of it stopped. And now they were paying attention. It was Cleo who figured out the rest. She asked to come by the Saturday after Thanksgiving, just her voice careful and small the way it gets when she's working up to something. I told her, of course, come for lunch. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a grilled cheese she barely touched, and after a while she reached into her jacket pocket and set something on the table between us. It was an old card, a Thanksgiving card I'd sent to Kenneth and Lindsay's previous address before they bought the house. Inside, in my handwriting, was a note I barely remembered writing, something about being grateful for them, about hoping the enclosed check helped with the move. She'd found a box of my old cards in the attic. She'd been up there last summer, helping me look for Monroe's record player. I hadn't known she'd noticed. Apparently she had. "Grandma," she said. "Yes. How long have you been paying for things?" I looked at the card. My handwriting then, and my handwriting, now looked like they belonged to different women. "A long time," I said. She was quiet. She was 16, and she had a stillness that made you forget how young she was. "They talked about not inviting you," she said, not a question. "I know," I said. "I heard them too." "So did I." She looked at the table. Her jaw worked the way it does when she's deciding what to say. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "You don't have anything to be sorry for." "I know," she said, "but I am anyway." We sat together. I made us both tea. She told me about a book she was reading for school. and I told her about finding the same book in the library once, back when I was still working, and lending it so many times the binding fell apart. She smiled at that. We finished our tea. She helped me do the dishes. When she left, she hugged me longer than she had in a while. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk to her car, and I thought, there are people who see you. You just have to stop expecting it from the ones who don't. Kenneth came alone on a Tuesday morning. About 2 weeks later. He parked at the curb and sat in the car for a few minutes before getting out. I watched from the window. He had his father's walk. That slight hesitation before a hard conversation, shoulders set forward like he was heading into wind. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked tired. Older than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I'd been too busy noticing whether he noticed me. We sat at the kitchen table. I offered coffee, he accepted. We sat with it between us a while before he spoke. I didn't know, he said, what you'd been covering, for how long. I just assumed. I don't know what I assumed. You didn't ask, I said, not unkindly, just true. No, he said, I didn't. He turned his mug in his hands. After a while, he said Cleo had told him things had changed, though she hadn't said what. I confirmed that yes, things had changed, and I didn't go into detail, because that wasn't what this conversation was for. I heard you, I said. In the kitchen, before Thanksgiving. He went still. Lindsay was talking, I said, but you didn't argue. He looked at the table. No, he said quietly, I didn't. That's what I needed to understand. We sat in silence. Outside, a car passed. The refrigerator hummed. I thought about Monroe, about how he used to say the people who love you should make you feel larger, not smaller. About the years I'd spent making myself small and convenient and calling it love. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Kenneth said finally. I just wanted you to know I understand why, and I'm sorry for letting it get here. I'm not angry with you, I said, but I've used up too many years trying to earn a seat at a table I built myself. I don't do that anymore. He nodded. His eyes were wet, which I hadn't expected, and I looked away for a moment. I stood without asking and ladled soup into a bowl for him, set it in front of him, sat back down. You can come visit, I said, but you come because you want to see me, not because you need something. I know, he said. We'll see, I answered. He didn't try to fill the silence with things he didn't mean. That was something. Allison came the following week without warning, in a coat too thin for December. She brought nothing except herself, which was, I realized later, the most honest thing she'd offered in a long time. She sat in the front room. She didn't make excuses. She said she'd spent 2 weeks thinking about what to say and still didn't have the right words. You don't need the right words, I told her. You just need the true ones. She told me she hadn't called the day after Thanksgiving about the money. She wanted me to know that. She called because Cleo had sent her a text she couldn't stop thinking about. 3 sentences, she read them to me off her phone. The last one was, she was carrying a dish of green beans, Aunt Allison. She drove 40 minutes to bring it, and nobody even knew she was there. Allison folded her hands in her lap. I keep seeing it, she said. You standing there. So do I said. What were you thinking? I considered it honestly, that I was tired of being grateful for being allowed in. She was quiet for a long time after that. I put the kettle on. When I set her cup down in front of her, she looked up and said simply, Thank you, Mom. Not for the tea, I understood that. Come back when you want to, I said, not when you have to. She said she would. I believed this time that she meant it. The December that followed was the quietest I'd had in years, and the most mine. Joanne came by twice, once to return my pie dish, once just because she was passing. Simon sent a thank you note in the mail, handwritten, which I put on the refrigerator next to an old photo of Monroe holding Cleo when she was a baby, both of them squinting into the afternoon sun. I didn't go to anyone's holiday party. I didn't drive anywhere with a dish of anything. On Christmas Eve, I sat in the front room with a fire going and Monroe's favorite Coltrane record on the player. Cleo had found it in the attic after all, underneath a box of old paperbacks, and I didn't feel the absence of noise the way I used to. The house was quiet in the way you only get when you've stopped waiting for something that isn't coming. I thought about the scholarship. Mr. Edgerton's office had sent confirmation that the first award would go out in the spring. A rising senior, somewhere in this county, would go to college on Monroe's name, study books and learning, and never know about the Thanksgiving I spent, standing in a hallway with a casserole I drove 40 minutes to bring. That was fine by me. The good things don't need witnesses. Outside, snow was falling. The first real snow of the year. I could hear it more than see it. The way it muffles everything, takes the edges off. I thought, I spent so many years making myself easy to overlook, and I called it love. I'm not sure what to call it now. Maybe just a long lesson with a very late ending. But I was still here. Still Virginia Delaney, born 1957, retired librarian, Monroe's wife, mother of 2, grandmother of 1 girl, who had sat at my kitchen table and apologized for something that wasn't her fault. Still the woman who knew the green bean casserole by heart and had finally, in the 67th year of her life, decided to leave it home. The fire crackled. The snow kept falling. I stayed where I was and let it. If this story touched something in you, pass it on. Somewhere out there, someone is standing in a hallway with both hands full, listening to a truth they were never meant to hear, and they need to know. It is never too late to set the dish down and walk towards something better.